Quick warning before we start. Number one on this list isn't a guy people argue about. It's a guy people stopped arguing about. And that's the actual crime. We did this to him. The whole basketball world collectively decided his greatness was settled, filed it away, and moved on. By the end of this video, you're going to wonder how that happened. 5 most disrespected NBA players ever. This isn't a highlight video. This is a corrections video. 5 players, 5 legacies the league still hasn't priced correctly. And I don't care if you've heard their names 1,000 times, you haven't heard the actual case. By the end of this video, you're going to understand why boring doesn't mean not great, why being someone's sidekick doesn't mean you weren't a top 20 player ever, and why one of the most clown big men in internet history is a legitimate top 5 defender of all time. Let's get into it. Tim Duncan, 5 rings, 3 finals MVPs, 2 regular season MVPs, 15 All-Star selections. And the most common thing people say about him is, yeah, but he was boring to watch. That's not a take. That's an excuse for not paying attention. The disrespect here isn't subtle. It's baked into how we even talk about him. He's never in greatest of all-time conversations the way Jordan, LeBron, or Kareem are, despite a resume that matches or beats half the names that do get mentioned. Tim Duncan won 5 championships across 3 different decades of basketball and somehow became the most boring superstar conversation in NBA history. Let that sit with you for a second. And here's a comparison that should make people uncomfortable. Duncan's finals rebounding numbers stack up with peak Shaq's. He just did it without the personality, the shoe deal, or the highlight package, which is exactly why nobody remembers it that way. The why here is simple. Quiet excellence doesn't get remembered the way loud excellence does. Duncan let his game speak, and the media filled the silence with boring instead of winner. If Duncan drops 30 and 15 in a finals closeout game today, screenshot this. He's the most disrespected winner basketball has ever produced. Scottie Pippen is next, and this one's almost criminal. Pippen guarded the best player at 4 different positions on a championship roster, and the entire conversation around him got reduced to Jordan's sidekick. 6 rings. Defensive Player of the Year caliber two-way wing before two-way wing was even a phrase people used. Compare him directly to peak Kawhi Leonard, both elite point-of-attack defenders who could initiate offense, both criminally undervalued as offensive engines because a bigger name got the spotlight. The difference is Kawhi gets 2-time finals MVP respect. Pippen gets second option disrespect, despite arguably being more impactful defensively than anyone wearing a Bulls jersey not named Jordan. Why does this happen? Because the greatest player ever happened to be standing right next to him. That's it. That's the whole reason. Proximity to greatness shouldn't shrink your own greatness, but in Pippen's case, that's exactly what happened for 30 years of NBA media coverage. One more thing before we move to name 3. Pippen finished in the top 10 in MVP voting multiple times during his prime. Top 10. Not great role player territory, actual MVP conversation territory. Nobody brings that up because the conversation about Pippen stopped being about Pippen decades ago. Chris Webber. This name is going to make some of you mad, and that's exactly the point. 5-time All-Star, one of the most gifted passing big men basketball has ever produced. And the entire conversation around him is draft bust and torn ACL guy instead of one of the most talented power forwards ever. Compare him to peak Karl Anthony Towns as a passing big. Webber was doing that 20 years earlier with a worse supporting cast in an era where big men weren't expected to be offensive hubs at all. The Sacramento Kings teams he led were some of the most fun, stylistically ahead of their time rosters in league history, and they never got a ring because of officiating controversies that are still debated to this day. Not because Webber wasn't elite. The why is brutal but simple. Injuries derailed the second half of his prime, and the league has a habit of remembering players by their decline instead of their peak. Webber's peak deserved a championship. The conversation around him still treats him like a cautionary tale instead of a top 15 power forward of his generation. Quick pause, because I want you to sit with one stat before we move on. Webber averaged more assists per game than several Hall of Fame point guards across his prime seasons as a power forward. Read that again. Now imagine that stat attached to a player who never got hurt. That's the player the league refused to talk about. Dwight Howard. I know what some of you are thinking already, and I want you to actually sit with the stats before you argue with me in the comments. Three-time Defensive Player of the Year, five-time rebounding champion, a genuine top five defensive center of all time, statistically. The problem is, everything that happened after his prime in Orlando, the trade demands, the locker room drama, the memification of his personality, completely buried how dominant he actually was defensively in his 20s. Compare him to peak Rudy Gobert as a rim-protecting anchor. Howard was doing it with more mobility, more rebounding gravity, and a more disruptive defensive radius than almost anyone of his generation. The why is simple. The internet decided he was a punchline before it decided he was a Hall of Famer, and the punchline stuck longer than the stats did. Dwight Howard's prime got buried under a decade of jokes about his decline. Klay Thompson closes this one out, and I genuinely think people will look back on this take in 10 years and agree with me. Klay gets talked about as the third best player on his own team's dynasty. Third, behind Curry, behind Draymond in defensive impact conversation sometimes. That is absurd for a guy who is a top five three-point shooter ever, and one of the most disciplined two-way wings of his generation. Compare him to prime Ray Allen as a pure shooter. Klay's efficiency, off-ball gravity, and on-ball defensive chops against the league's best wings put him in a different tier than great shooter, nothing else. He guarded MVPs in final series. He hit shots in Game 6 closeouts that should be talked about as much as any clutch shot in modern playoff history. The why is obvious. When you play next to two other Hall of Fame caliber stars, the box score gets split three ways and the credit gets split unevenly. Klay's legacy is going to get a serious reevaluation the further we get from his prime, and it's going to be in his favor. That's five names: Tim Duncan, Scottie Pippen, Chris Webber, Dwight Howard, Klay Thompson. Five completely different reasons for disrespect. Too quiet, too close to a legend, too injury derailed, too memed, too overshadowed. Same result every time. The numbers got buried under a narrative. One name almost made this list, and I need to know if I made the wrong call leaving him off. 3 rings. 3-time all-defensive first team. Spent years as the primary assignment on prime Kobe Bryant in the playoffs. Never made an all-star team. Never sniffed a max contract. I'm not saying the name. You're going to have to fight about it in the comments, and if enough of you agree on who it is, he's getting his own full video. Drop your most disrespected player in the comments below, and if it's not already on this list, tell me why it should have been. If this is your first time on the channel, we do this every week, taking the takes nobody else wants to say out loud and backing them up with the numbers. Hit subscribe so the next one finds you. Next video, we're flipping this completely. Watch out.